happened to it historically, and then we will slowly recontextualize it using these 5 layers. And this will show us this will allow us to unlock sort of the unknown layers of mystery and metaphysics encoded in this artifact of the mummy. And then we will swiftly compare also our treatment of the mummy, of modernity as a displaced exotic commodity, and its actual meaning once we recontextualize it that it had in the ancient Egyptian culture, which is an interesting thought experiment, because it will teach us also a lot about ourselves, about our own culture, and about our own psychological outlook on a lot of the themes that the mummy touches upon. Because of course we know the mummy usually as some sort of resurrected corpse that is haunting our pop culture or is being unwrapped, and we will get to that later in some I would say ghoulish mummy unwrapping parties. And once we recontextualize it, we will have, I would say, almost an epiphany, because we can see on this one example what a huge difference it makes when you finally know the entire cultural context behind it, and how different how deeply your perspective changes. We will start with a bit of a historical run through of mummy commodification, because yes, mummy commodification has an entire 100-year-long history, and then we'll follow it through modernity. And I just wanted to say, if any of you at any point want to click unmute your microphone and you want to contribute something, you will see I will also start like putting some questions out there, some reflections out there. Feel free to jump in and ask or add to what I'm saying, because like I said, the first part of the lecture, where we follow the mummy throughout our own culture, is the part where I would encourage you to engage in what we call anthropological self-reflection. And like I said, we have all encountered the mummy in one form or other, and usually we see it either as a horror trope, or we see it as a displaced artifact in a museum, or we see somebody on the History Channel shove it inside an MRI machine. So this kind of constant pseudo-scientific approach, or it's just used as a complete trope. But what you've probably never ever heard is any sort of recontextualization, which is in itself really interesting, because we have all these history channels, all these documentaries, but never ever do people really fully contextualize the mummy again. And there's proof of that, and the proof is how we still treat it, by displaying it in museums and treating it the way we do. So the reason why there is mummies seemingly everywhere, and why there is such a, I would say, ubiquity of mummies outside of Egypt, this can be traced to what I would call the most shameless commodification of antique artifacts in human history. There are numbers, there are estimates that up to 1 million mummies, or at least hundreds of thousands, were exported and sold. And it all started in the 700 years ago, and even longer, around the 12th century. And it is impossible to know exactly why it started, or the exact time. All we know is that in the early Middle Ages, there was already a trade, and it is assumed that it was because of a misunderstanding, because of the Arabic name for mummies, which is mumia. This is, we will get to the original name that the Egyptians had for it later. So this term mumia led to the confusion, where traders thought that it somehow contained a very precious substance, which is a sort of healing asphalt or bitumen found in the Persian mountains. So all of a sudden this craze started, where they started trading mummies for all sorts of healing potions and ailments. And this went on all through the 16th century. And it got so bad that they started scraping off the resin that was on top of mummies. And when they ran out of easily available mummies, they even started faking mummies, and they used prisoners. And we don't want to know the exact sources, but they produced mummies for the black market. And so this is how bad it already got in the 16th and 17th centuries. And this was with a full fraudulent black market. And like I said, hundreds of thousands being exported. But that was before Napoleon arrived and started what we call Egyptomania in the entirety of Europe and the rest of the world. And this entire field of the reception of ancient Egypt that was spawned by this phenomenon called Egyptomania is a research field in and of its own in Egyptology. When I started Egyptology in Basel, there was a full seminar that I took that dealt with this whole problem, how ancient Egypt, with it the mummy, entered the cultural bloodstream of modernity. And it all is traced back to the French and Napoleon. Because what he did is he went into ancient Egypt in his conquest. It was in 1798. He, of course, lost completely. It was a military disaster, which is interesting because it's also the reason why Egypt was not easily conquered, because they all basically died in the desert because they had really underestimated as long marches through the desert, but that is only an aside. So he invaded Egypt with 167 scientists and artists. And what they did is they documented everything they found. They painted everything and created what we now know as the Description d'Egypte. It's a beautiful tome, which is thankfully available online if you want to take a look. And it has a lot of preserved etchings and sketches of all then visible temples, artifacts that you could find in ancient Egypt back then. So they were very thorough, and they of course also discovered the Rosetta Stone. And since the military campaign was a complete disaster, Napoleon started a PR campaign acting like he actually culturally conquered ancient Egypt and pushing for this Description d'Egypte in Europe as a cultural conquest of ancient Egypt, because he, of course, wanted to deflect from the fact that his fleet was sunk in the Mediterranean, and he, I don't know, killed, I think, up to hundreds of thousands of soldiers. So that was the whole PR campaign behind it, and it worked. And it sparked one of the biggest crazes in Europe that was only rivaled later on in 1920 after they discovered the tomb of Tutankhamun, but I will get to that in a minute. And in 1809, between 1809 and 1829, they published this Description d'Egypte, and this multi-volume work triggered this obsession with Egyptian design, but again, it sparked a huge mummy market. So this is when the real exports began, and everybody wanted a mummy. And then we also have the first, I would say, pop culture entry of the mummy. So we have novels. And the interesting part is that in this early stage, the mummy was always romanticized. The mummy got a backstory that was always romantic. So it was all about the finding of a lost queen or of a lost prince, and that was encountered in the shape of the mummy. And the big breakthrough then was, of course, in 1822 when Jean-Paul Lyon deciphered, not on his own, but he was the one who made the final breakthrough, the Rosetta Stone, and therefore made hieroglyphs readable. And that is when it all went crazy. And then it all entered what we call the Victorian or industrial era, and starting in the 1830s and up until the 1890s, we have scientific mummy unwrappings. And here it gets really interesting when we want to also look at how our culture dealt with ancient Egypt. So first, we conquer it culturally. Okay, so we first take a perfect record of everything, then we immediately commodify it, and then we scientifically examine it by unwrapping everything. So it's a complete, I would say, focus on the physicality of the things, on the object matter, and to the excuse of this era, I would say they were not yet quite able to read everything, because for instance, the Book of the Dead was not fully translated until 1942. So they were pretty much in the dark about the background of the metaphysical background and the cultural background of everything. So all they had was the object culture and the physical culture. So all they could literally do was unwrap everything, export everything, and gawk at the aesthetics, because they were not yet able to really decipher the culture through its own writing. And these mummy unwrappings then also led to a new market. So now the mummies were ground down and they were used for pigment. There was a mummy color that was extremely popular. So great painters all used mummy color. Then there was Edgar Allan Poe, who famously wrote his book where a mummy gets resurrected, and also scientifically, again, through electricity. And then interestingly enough, they start asking the mummy questions in the book, and they ask the mummy questions of the human condition. They ask, why are we here? What is it all about? And that's another interesting approach towards this culture that we also have in the medieval time, where people believed that the mummy and the whatever was secreted from the mummy had magical powers. So it's this sort of half exoticized, externalized magical power meets we want to know everything about the human condition from this other, from this exotic culture. And the same goes for themes of death and the resurrected corpse. Is there a way to bring back loved ones, which we saw in the first romanticization phase, where people started imagining a life after death, but in a sort of mechanical, again, physical way, not in a metaphysical way, because as I believe, they had not yet access to the actual cultural and metaphysical concepts behind it. But as we will later see, even when they did, nobody really cared about it. But anyway, we move on. So the Edgar Allan Poe mummy is being circled, and the in 1882, Britain again invades Egypt, and this leads us to what is called the golden age of discovery, or the earliest 20th century, which saw another surge in Egyptomania, and the whole perception of the mummy changes here. In 1903, Bram Stoker, the author of Dracula, releases a mummy book, The Jewel of the Seven Stars, and this follows an archaeologist and his daughter, and they attempt in a supernatural ritual to resurrect Queen Tera, an ancient Egyptian sorceress. So here we have all of these elements. We have magic, we have the archaeologist, so we have this sort of scientific approach, and we have the romantic approach of resurrection and life after death, sort of the new exotic option of living on in the form of a resurrected corpse. And but again, this sort of exoticized trope wrapped around it. And in 1922, of course, we have Howard Carter, who finds the tomb of Tutankhamun, and this is where the curse of the mummy enters the cultural bloodstream. So this is where this whole it started with Bram Stoker. There is also a curse aspect that forms, and in 1920, this is in full steam. And this whole thing, the discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun, ignited a global pop culture frenzy. And this is also when the mummy slowly drifts into pulp, into horror, and becomes more and more of a completely, I would say, isolated trope in our culture. So nobody really asks anymore what it is, what it can do. Although at this point we have the Book of the Dead, we have all the metaphysical background, we have a lot of their important texts translated, but the mummy takes on a life of its own. It's no longer so shamelessly commodified and unwrapped. There is sort of a new like scientific approach. Archaeology and Egyptology have now formed fully as a discipline. So people try more and more to treat it with a little, like seemingly more respect. But at the same time, like I said, there is a new mummy, the famous mummy movie with Boris Karloff is released. And then in the 1940s, we have a whole slew of generic mummy movies. And when we look at this entire history of 120 years of, I would say, modernity and how we treated the mummy, we have all of the elements that I already mentioned. But the really interesting part is, like I said, there is never a real approach to recontextualize the mummy. Even if you look at modern documentaries, usually what is done with them is the physicality is always approached. There's always, people always look, oh, he has a mosquito bite here. It's always this a sensationalized trope of, is there really a curse of the mummy? They actually try to find out what the mummy has eaten. So they look at the stomach, they look at diseases, and they MRI scan it all the time, or they do a DNA test because they want to know who's the son of who. And it leads usually nowhere, but it's always around the physicality. And it's always a sort of morbid corpse culture around it. And it's never a real, I would say, organic and ancient Egyptian approach towards it that actually tries to understand what the mummy was all about and what it really meant. Because if we did that, we would have to, I would say, reevaluate how we treat it even today in museums, and why we put them on display unwrapped. I mean, those are actually dead people, and we are in complete, I would say, I can't find a disrespect in what their belief system would dictate to do with a mummy, which we'll see in a minute. So what I would like to put out there is a bit of a psychological and cultural self-reflection, why we approach the subject of death, a corpse from another culture, the way we did, with romanticization, magical projection, and a sort of attempt to imbibe it, to consume it. I mean, the fact, oh, I didn't say that. They were also ground down during the Victorian age. They were ground down and they were actually eaten. And also in the medieval phase, it was used as an actual ointment, and I think also imbibed and actually eaten. So from a psychological standpoint, this is also very interesting how we try to sort of metabolize this corpse and this symbol of death. And what I now want to do is to recontextualize the mummy, and I want to follow the different stages that I use to structure the course. And there's a reason for these stages that we will follow, because those stages lead us organically, and how the ancient Egyptians would have wanted us to, into their culture, into their metaphysical system and their worldview. So we can understand not only the mummy, but afterwards, I would say almost every aspect of their culture better and clearer, because we will finally be able to embed it in a larger cultural logic that is so completely different from ours that it leads to what we just saw with the mummy, to a complete misunderstanding, a misplacement, and a sort of strange misplaced existence outside of its original cultural context. So these 6 tiers is that first we approach it through the language, through the hieroglyphs and the word they actually had for the mummy. And then we go through their mythic thinking, how they structured the world through mythological thought, and of course the myth of Osiris, the first mummy. And then we go a little bit deeper into their concept of reality and time within a cosmogonic universe, because the mummy symbolizes that very concept. And that leads us deeper into cosmology, which is the third part of our course. And then we go to their mortuary beliefs. The context here, the connection is obvious. And we will see how the texts and the knowledge of these mortuary beliefs, they not only allow us deeper insights, they also almost initiate us into one of the deepest mysteries within ancient Egyptian culture that is encoded in the mummy. And then when we go to the lens of meaning, we will encounter how the mummy is one node in a very intricate web of interconnectedness and meaning that spans the entire cosmos, which the Egyptians called Ma'at. And in our final bonus lesson, we will then encounter the lens where we see the mummy as, I would say, as a trope within the full crisis. I would say the apocalyptic system, because interestingly enough, if we look at the crisis literature of ancient Egypt, we will see that what we are doing with the mummy today is actually the greatest horror they could ever imagine. So to give you the examples, first with the language and hieroglyphs, the actual word for hieroglyph, sach, which meant mummy, has in itself the encoded what you try to become through mummification, which is an ach. This is a transformed soul. I will explain that later. And the S means the intention grammatically, the intention to become an ach. And this is what the mummy was actually called, written with a little symbol of the mummy in the end. I think I can, I'll put it in the chat later. So in this very word, we have encoded the different soul aspects that the Egyptians believed in, that every human being had, and the transformation needed to enter eternal life, which is you had to reintegrate the one soul aspect, which is the ba. This could be translated as a modern word soul. It has inherent our most personal traits. And then there is the ka, which could be translated as the spirit, but also has some social and outward facing aspects, but it is usually translated as a spirit or a life force. So the ba and the ka have to be unified within the mummy, and they form the ach, which is a different, I would say, entity after death that can then live on in the afterlife. So this is all encoded in the word sach, that actually means mummy. So if we use the second layer, the myth, we encounter the myth of Osiris, also in the course, and see that Osiris was the foundational myth of ancient Egypt, but he was also the first mummy. He was the first to be ever mummified. And here in this myth, we encounter the mummy as a magical device used by Isis. So what the ancient Egyptians believed is that death is ultimately a disintegration. All of your different parts, all of your different spiritual parts, your social aspects, everything that makes up a human being disintegrates upon death and has to be reintegrated through the process of mummification. Needed for that are certain magical aspects, which we'll counter in a minute when we go to the mortuary cult, and mummification. Mummification is a making whole again of a disintegrated physical body after death. And that's why it is so sacred. The very wrapping, the very process of it is extremely sacred, because this is where everything that falls apart upon hitting the barrier that is death is put back together and obviously put in the tomb. It is also the place where a deep mystery takes place. And in the words of the ancient Egyptians themselves in their Book of the Dead, it is where the greatest mystery of all takes place. And that is the unification inside the original mummy of Osiris, which in this case symbolizes a sphere of transition, or the underworld, and the sun god. The sun god and Osiris, they merge in the 6th hour of every night and give birth to life and the sun itself. So both the sun cycle and life itself spring from this sacred and mysterious union. And the Egyptians themselves said, this is the greatest mystery of all. If you understand this, this is the ultimate initiation. If you know what is meant by that, that life can only come from this convergence of different temporal spheres and different aspects of the sun and death, then you've understood it. So what do I mean by temporal spheres? The sun is the cyclical time, here we go into the deeper mystery of how they imagined the universe. Sun is cyclical, so it's ever recurring, and it has to be always renewed. And Osiris and the symbol of the mummy is a different time sphere of a transitional space that we all have to traverse in order to get to the afterlife. So this is the underworld, a sort of space where everything is suspended, but also within transition to get to another place, which they call the afterlife. And the sun has to travel through this liminal space every night in order to be renewed and be united with Osiris. And all of this is summed up and symbolized in the symbol of the mummy. And this leads us to the third lesson of the course, but also the third principle, which is the cosmogenic universe, or their cosmology. So they believed that the universe was in a constant state of renewal, of rebirth, and had to constantly be reborn. And the mummy was therefore a symbol of this constant, I would say, process of rebirth. So there were a lot of festivals for Osiris with the mummy, where they would have so-called corn mummies that would sprout outside of the mummy. They would sprout corn and would symbolize this renewal and this cosmic generator of life that was believed to be encapsulated in the concept of the mummy. And so the mummy is really a symbol for this constant process of regeneration, cosmic rebirth through death. How the sun brings life force. This is also very important. Life was not believed to be inherent in our cosmos. It was something that was believed to be brought in from an outside sphere, which was symbolized by the sun god. So it's something that we constantly had to bring into this reality. It's not something that's naturally in here, in their belief system. And it could only be brought in here through this liminal realm of the underworld. So they had to be a transitional realm that had to be kept open for this mysterious process to occur. And Osiris, always symbolized through the mummy, was this liminal realm and this space where this could occur. And he was always depicted as a mummy. And this brings us also to the mortuary beliefs. How could everyday people take part in this great mystery, in this renewal of life? Because this is where it all becomes sort of a religious system. They believed that what happens with the body when we die, I already said, is after that, it is possible to partake in this great mystery by going through the mummification process, by emulating the first mummy, the first great myth, Osiris, and the regenerative process. You could partake in this great mystery and in this cosmogenic process. So what happened after you died? You would get mummified. There are 3 different tiers of mummifications. That's also a big misunderstanding. People think this was only something that was accessible to kings or to high officials. This was the highest tier, which was a 70-day natron generated process where your organs were fully mummified and you were wrapped in this very month-long process. But there were also different treatments. You could get a cedar oil treatment with a liquefaction of your organs, or you could just get a quick rinse and dry out in the desert sand. So mummification was actually accessible to a lot more people than we believe. It was not only accessible to kings. It was something that was widely spread, and everybody tried to attain it because everybody wanted to partake in this sacred ritual. Another thing that had to happen with the mummy is the opening of the mouth ritual, which restored your faculties in the afterlife. And a lot of what happened in the tomb was all centered around the mummy, because the mummy was believed to be the anchor where, what I mentioned in the beginning, not only the reintegration of the 2 souls could occur, also another great mystery could occur here, which allowed one part of the soul, the Ba, to go forth by day. And to go forth by day means it could come back from the afterlife and roam the world in a different spiritual form. So Go Forth by Day is the original title and the real title of the Book of the Dead. So that was the goal of the spells around, all centered around the mummy, because the mummy was the anchor. Without the mummy, the soul could not find its way back into this part of life, into this sphere of being, and roam the world. And at the same time, this great mystery that I described before also happened within the mummy. So for the deceased to achieve eternal life and become an ach, which is they call it an effective spirit, which could then enter into another sphere of being, the afterlife, the mummy also had to stay intact and inside the tomb. So this unification, reintegration, unification, and great mystery could take place within the mummy. And the spells that we know from the coffin text and from the Book of the Dead, for instance, are all they are all geared towards enabling all of this. Traverse the afterlife, reach traverse the underworld, reach the afterlife, be fully intact when you reach the afterlife, be reunified. The spells are also about the opening of the mouth of the mummy. There are a lot of spells that are specifically about the mummy, and like I said, giving the deceased its faculties back by using the physicality of the actual mummy and these spells. So now we get to the fifth layer, which is the whole meaning of this, and how the mummy is one node within this greater web of interconnected meaning and the very fabric of reality. We already heard that with the mummification, by becoming a mummy yourself, you would partake in this great mystery and in this great regenerative process, but also because the ancient Egyptians imagined the entire universe to be one great interconnected web of cosmic order, which they called Ma'at. By keeping your mummy intact, you would honor the fact that they believed every one of us was a blossom on a single vine. So the plenitude of the one, and an expression, one expression of the great oneness that we all are. So the mummy was a sort of anchor within the system, and to keep the mummy alive was to honor this one manifestation, this unique manifestation that you and your life represented in this greater web of existence. So now we come to what would be the sixth part of the lesson, which is their crisis literature, or their greatest apocalypse. What was their greatest fear? Obviously, their greatest fear was to be robbed of all of this. Because if you take the mummy out of the tomb, you take away their soul's ability to roam the world, to go forth by day, which was what their entire mortuary system was centered around. You also rob them of of partaking in this great mystery of renewal, and you basically do the worst thing to them that they could ever imagine, because to them, the worst thing that their apocalypse was that the whole system that was ancient Egypt, this entire fabric that they thought they were keeping alive through ritual, this cosmogenic universe would someday stop. All of their rituals would stop, and the world would fall into chaos, and the very fabric of our reality would decay and then lead to lack and disease and war and horror. And to them, that was symbolized in tomb robbery, and because that was the ultimate hubris, it was the ultimate crime. It was also, when you look at capital punishment in ancient Egypt, you encountered specifically for tomb robbery. And when people were, because the ancient Egyptians shied away from capital punishment, but if you touched the mummy, and there's actual court documents that show this, if you touched and desecrated a mummy, you were dead. That was the worst crime they could imagine. So this brings me back to the complete lack of recontextualization in modern times, because if anybody had any respect for this culture or their belief system, we would at least display them in a way that would, in some sort of form, recontextualize them within a tomb. So if you have to unwrap a mummy and display it, which I think is already problematic, but that's just my personal opinion, at least put it back into its tomb environment, where it can do what they believed needed to be done within this entire metaphysical system. Well, we don't do that. And the same thing is when modern documentaries pretend to give you a deeper insight into the mummy by shoving it into an MRI or by unwrapping it. They're doing you a disfavor, because you learn actually nothing about what the mummy really is. You just gawk at an unwrapped corpse. And I think, without this sort of moralizing approach, but I think it's very interesting that we do that. We have all this information available. We could learn about everything that I just explained to you, but we choose not to for some reason, because there are, enough historians out there that could write scripts for documentaries, but for some reason we choose to still keep the mummy commodified and only examine it for its physicality or for its sensationalized market allure, but we hardly ever try to deeply understand all the metaphysical wisdom that is behind it. Yeah, I think that might be a great start for a discussion or for some questions. But this is what I have for you today.
Thank you. Seth had a question.
Can you hear
Mr.
me?
Pinston. Yes, sir.
I think my question, this whole idea of the curse of the mummy is kind of intriguing, and I'm wondering, if insofar as it was a horror trope, what exactly, if we can see it as a symptom, a cultural symptom of something, how could we interpret this? What exactly is it a curse for, or a punishment for? Maybe you could elaborate on that a bit.
Well, like I just said, the disturbance of a mummy was considered a great crime. So there are court documents that show when tomb robbers went into a tomb, they differentiated between just taking the objects or actually taking the mummy, what they sometimes did. Sometimes they even burned the mummies. I don't know why, but that was considered a great crime. So you could say there are some aspects of this curse. There are some inscriptions that say that you will die a horrible death. Yes, if you were caught disturbing the mummy, you did die a horrible death. That's, like I said, that was a place where they actually applied capital punishment. But I think where it came from is what I said in the beginning. In the 1920s, the horror genre got a hold of it, and it sort of made the whole tomb robbing that they engaged in, it made it very marketable, because it turned you into the haunted one. And you said, oh, it's not us going in there doing a horrible thing to this culture, it's us being haunted by their bad mummy. So that's, I can only hypothesize where this whole curse thing came from. Which is interesting, because I also wrote on my Substack about that, what the ancient Egyptians actually did in the tomb. They would ask you, if you walked into the tomb, they would not curse you or anything. They would actually ask you, hey, while you're here, you could bring some beer and some provisions, because that's what they actually needed for the afterlife. So they would not really curse you for going in there. They actually wanted rituals to take place in their tomb. So there is also a phenomenon which is called the false door, where another soul aspect could re-enter this world. So they very much still wanted to be alive of the part of this world. So it was actually not about haunting everybody who entered the tomb. It was very much an attempt to still keep a sort of relationship going, where you, either as a priest or as a family member, could still bring libations and provisions for the deceased to the tomb.
Very interesting. Thank you, Carla.
Thanks, Seth.
Yeah.
Sorry, Carla, go on.
Um,
Should I read that for you, Seraphim?
Oh, I didn't look at the
Yeah, I
chat.
can read it.
Oh, you can read it.
I
Yeah,
was
go ahead.
just wondering about Carla's. I mean, I appreciate the surprise that modern science would have absolutely no sensibility for the metaphysical, but I mean, I just wonder why we would be surprised by the fact that modern popular scientific approaches, like the History Channel, for example, or whatever, to mummies and Egyptology in general, lacks any sense of the metaphysical whatsoever. Metaphysics was killed by Descartes and Hume. Why would we expect it to be resurrected by modern Egyptology?
Yeah, I'm trying to be polite with my surprise. I'm not really surprised. You're right.
Yeah, okay.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's I also think that there is a within Egyptology, because there is so much esoteric nonsense floating around, there is a sort of knee-jerk reaction to everything metaphysical, to everything that goes even remotely into that realm, because Egyptology has fought very hard to differentiate itself from all esoteric publications and like pseudoscience that's been circling around. So I think that's also a reason why Egyptologists try desperately to stay away from all of this, and they don't want to use any sort of spiritual language around the topic, and they always want to stay very, very sober and rational and scientific around it. So that's also why nobody wants to talk about the pyramids. There's a lot of topics that are marginalized in Egyptology because nobody wants to touch it. There is, for instance, magic. It's only the brave colleagues in Chicago. They don't care. They do great work on ancient Egyptian magic, and I have some of the greatest scholars working on that. But a lot of other schools, like the German School of Egyptology, they don't want to touch it. They don't want to go near it because it's pretty wild what they had. I mean, they had a sort of state-sanctioned magic that they practiced, and nobody wants to talk about this because everybody is sort of afraid to entangle Egyptology with this huge area of esotericism that's roaming around.
But I mean, there is a serious esotericism apart from woo. And I think, if you have this fear of woo, you're taken to the other extreme where people like Zahi Hawass and others have an absolute dominant reign on all Egyptologies that no creative ideas, let alone metaphysical ideas, are allowed into the sphere of discourse whatsoever.
Yes, you have probably recognized who I meant when I said shoving into the MRI machine. So that's all I can say. But his power is not only about, I would say in the realm of research, it's also that when you excavate in ancient Egypt, it will be taken away by who you just mentioned. So yeah, there is a lot of gatekeeping and power. So it's a slippery slope. And but there is, in German-speaking Egyptology, there are two great books about one is actually called the Lore of Ancient Egypt by Erik Hornung, where he goes deep into the esoteric interpretations of ancient Egypt. And then Jan Assmann, who I constantly quote, also was not afraid to go deep into those topics, not so much into magic or the metaphysical, but also like into the esoteric and into the reception history that I mentioned in the beginning. But those are not books usually that are known well in the mainstream. There's a huge difference between what is known about ancient Egypt in the mainstream and what ancient Egypt really was when you read it through their literature and through their own cultural texts. That is a huge difference. And then there's also this whole field of how Egypt was received and memorized. And Jan Assmann, for instance, wrote about this. He called it Nemo history. Is it that there is an entire field in historical research that deals with how modernity remembers ancient cultures and why we remember them like that, why it is necessary for us to project certain things on these ancient cultures that have nothing to do with the truth and are still very gratifying to us. And one of these things is that we always want to tell history as a progression, as an evolutionary progression. It started with the ancient Greeks who did the same thing. They always want to tell history from a viewpoint where you say, oh, we used to be barbaric, and now we're constantly progressing on a great evolution of men. And we, of course, happen to be the pinnacle of it. So our civilization is always at the top. And we look down to the past, where they did these like superstitious, stupid rituals, and they had all these strange beliefs, and look at their gods, and they have animal heads. But if we went deeper into this, all of this falls apart, because we realize, wow, this is a great metaphysical system. It's actually very advanced when you look at the worldview, and so we would have to abandon this evolutionary theory where we are the pinnacle with our great monotheism and science and everything. And we would have to abandon that and meet that culture on eye level if we actually wanted to learn something. I think that's also in the way of not only recontextualizing the mummy, but really approaching ancient cultures with some sort of earnestness and real interest.
This may be a good time just to interject briefly. If you haven't joined yet, join Carla's course. Here's the link to enroll. So I think Robert has a question, Harris. So Harris was first. Harris, could you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, thank you.
Hi, Harris. Good you hear, by the way.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, awesome. Thank you, Johannes, and thank you, Carla. This is very interesting. I think I will be able to join the course. So yeah, my question has to do with something very specific coming from the Jungian notion and concept of archetypes. So I think I've noticed a gap, and I would like to present it to Carla to get her opinion. First of all, I am not well versed in Egyptian mythology, but as far as I can tell, Isis seems to represent the archetype of the reassembler.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so and this has to do in terms of restoration, reconstitution, and also wholeness, right?
Yes.
It seems to me that Jung missed to identify that specific archetype for some reason. Like he went on and on about the mother, the Senex, the trickster, the magician, and all the other types. But he didn't specifically identify this archetype of the reassembler. And I think there is something to be gained there. First of all, in terms of why Jung did not include it. And to my understanding, this has to do with the fact that he was more interested into psychic structures and not process archetypes. And I think Isis in her mythic identity represents a process archetype. This process of searching, gathering, restoring and revivifying Osiris. So
yeah, I think it's a perfect mythical read of Isis. It's exactly what she is and what she represents in ancient Egyptian metaphysics. She's that cohesion. She's an element of cohesion that brings together these great conflicting forces. So we have Set and we have Osiris, we have chaos, and we have order. We have agriculture and renewal of life in the symbol of Osiris. And who is in the middle? Because Isis is also, she's the sister of Set and she's the wife of Osiris. So she is a great reintegrator and she's the great unifier. And also she's the one who uses magic. And this is a terrible word because it doesn't do actual justice to what she's capable of. It means that she's somebody who can actively modify the very fabric of reality with what she does. So it's very powerful. And that is usually overlooked. It's always, everybody always looks at the two opposing forces, but hardly ever at the great unifier in the middle. So that, I love that you pointed that out. And to the Jung question, I'm a big fan of Jung. I lived in Vienna for a very long time, and I'm not so familiar with his archetypes, but I think it is simply a different system, like you already mentioned. This is a system of the human psyche, and not necessarily a system of like a whole metaphysical system. That's not what Jung tried to do. So maybe that's why this element is absent. However, Jan Assmann once wrote is that the Osiris myth with Isis in it was what gave the ancient Egyptians their psychological landscape and a psychological language. So your comparison is very apt, because also the great Egyptologist Jan Assmann observed that for the Osiris myth and for Isis, that this really signified their inner psychological landscape as well, because Osiris was a king that suffered, that was betrayed, he was killed, and then overcame death with the help of Isis, and was gathered together. And so it's also a sort of collective catharsis in there for ancient Egypt to overcome these great forces that we're constantly confronted with, especially when you live in a desert that can only survive if the Nile flood brings fertile silt. Otherwise, you're wiped out. So they were constantly confronted with complete destruction and the horror of the desert coming in and eating up their entire country. And it is assumed that the Osiris myth and the power of Isis to bring everything together, to bring these horrendous forces together, was a sort of psychological catharsis for the ancient Egyptian, or represented that.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Harris. Hope you can join. Robert.
Yes, I just wanted to say, as an Egyptian, I really appreciate your approach, Carla, to Egyptology, taking the ideas of ancient Egyptians seriously, as opposed to just treating it in an objectified manner, as you mentioned. So one thing that came to mind as a commentary, and I'm sure JN can say more about this, but like the German distinction between human science and natural science, I think is a very useful one here to think about in terms of your approach to Egyptology being more human scientific as opposed to natural scientific. And we need to see more of that. So I'm excited about this line of research, and I hope to see it thrive moving forward.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And sometimes I also have to make it when I write on other platforms, that I come from the German tradition and studied in Basel, and that is even among Egyptologists really a thing that we always ask each other, like, where did you learn? Because there is a huge gap and a huge chasm almost between the American approach, the English approach, like of the English speaking, and the German approach. And I personally, why I decided when I was 15 years old to study Egyptology was because of an Egyptian Egyptologist. I was lucky enough to have an Egyptian Adel Egyptologist lead me on my first tour through ancient Egypt, and he had the same approach. That was, interestingly enough, very natural scientific. So he talked about how the ancient Egyptians probably knew about the greater structures within the cosmos, and he showed me like the stars on the ceiling of the tombs, and he showed me inscriptions that signify that to him could mean that they had a greater astrophysical knowledge, and that completely fascinated me. And that's something that I learned from an Egyptian Egyptologist. And I think if you bring it all together in a very, like I said, in an earnest approach, where you really encounter this culture on eye level and not from a top down, we're the pinnacle and they were the barbaric past or the sort of superstitious primitive past. If you really meet it on eye level, from both sides, also from natural science and a humanistic science, I think you can just gain much deeper insights. It's a lot more what you can get out of this encounter with this culture than when you only look at the surface level sensationalized tropes. So it is, to me, it's been extremely valuable and fascinating.
Excellent. We had Iris wanted to ask a question, but she's maybe had connection issues. I don't know,
I'm
she's
still
dropped.
here.
Oh, you're here. Okay, good. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Carla. So my question is around the language itself, the hieroglyphic, maybe the sacred language. I think I was looking at the court syllable, and it looks like you will be kind of like talking more about how maybe kind of like how to read or comprehend or understand the Egyptian language. And if we kind of compare that to what we're familiar with, kind of like an alphabetical language, it's very different. I'm saying that because when I think the earlier discussion on the Osiris myth, I was thinking one of the versions of the stories that I've heard, Isis to resurrect Osiris, she approached Ra, the sun god, to obtain his real name, his magical name, and use it as a spell to essentially perform the resurrection on Osiris. So clearly there's some kind of like magical or sacred significance to that language. So maybe you could give us a taste on your interpretation.
Yeah, that's a very integral part. The power that they believed language had, that you could actually speak things into existence, and the knowledge of names throughout the mortuary literature, like the Book of the Dead, and all different aspects of magic, which is, like I said, actually a modification of the fabric of reality, is I learned this from our Chicago colleagues. They said we should not really use the word magic, but anyway. What I do in the lesson, in lesson 1 of the course, is I give you a full rundown of how the language functioned as the cultural logic of the language, how it functions, its inner structure, and how the signs and hieroglyphs themselves functioned. And they were believed, the symbolic writing system was believed to be their greatest cultural technology. So they did not see it as something superstitious or something religious, because they didn't make these distinctions. They saw it as a piece of technology. And what I show in the first lesson, I give actual hieroglyphic examples, hieroglyphic spellings of different metaphysical words pertaining to death or traversing the afterlife, where you see very interesting subtexts that is encoded in the hieroglyphic script. And I also talk about their belief in the power of language. So there is an example that I give where I show hieroglyphs that are cut off in the middle. So they have this quail chick or a little snake, and they're both cut off in an attempt to render them harmless, because they believed that hieroglyphs were so powerful, not only in their written capacity, but also in their spoken capacity, that they could actually do harm, because they were believed to have an inherent power to bring things into being. So that's important to understand about the language. But there is also, of course, a very sober aspect to the language. It was a grammatical system. It had letters. So every single sound that you have in ancient Egyptian, they had some other sounds from our language. They had guttural sounds like ah and a lot of sounds and sounds. So every single one of these sounds, they had an actual hieroglyph for this, but it was still not an alphabetical language. There are different elements to it. Some signs that we all know, for instance, the scarab is a good example. The scarab could be both a triliteral sign, spelling H-P-R, Cheper, or it could be a symbol, which meant manifestation, or it could mean to become something. So it really depends where the hieroglyph is placed, and it could change functions, which was one of the biggest reasons why it took so long to decipher hieroglyphs. They have all different functions, and there's a great ambiguity in how they're used within the same text. And there is a deeper metaphysical aspect to them, but sometimes there's also just a very sober grammatical function, or it just spells 3 letters. And this ambiguity was what threw all the translators off, because they always thought it was an either or situation, either letters or some symbols, or purely like metaphysical notions, like not even symbols in terms of like modern Chinese is written with icons or in an iconographic way, but even deeper, like for a long time it was believed that it was not even spelling actual words or something. So that's what threw everybody off. The answer is it's all of these things, and it's mixed in a very interesting way. If you look at the translation scene in the movie Stargate, where he comes in and an Egyptologist has translated 2 lines of text and they still can't open the Stargate, he then goes in there and says, oh, what school what book did you use? And he has completely different translations. The reason for that is, and that's also a reason why you always have to say, which school of Egyptology do you come from? Because there's still a lot of confusion on how to actually translate certain words or how to translate certain texts, because there is such an ambiguity that in some cases, we're still not 100% sure. And that's what makes it so fascinating. It's a completely different way of thinking that's also encoded in there. And I go into all of this in the first lesson with a lot of examples. And in the end, you will be able to read an entire obelisk.
Excellent. Great. So I don't know if maybe we have time for one more question, if there is a final question. Does anyone have a question?
Mike asked if there are any traces of Egyptian mummy practices in other Near Eastern civilizations. I also studied Near Eastern archaeology, and I have not encountered mummification or anything remotely similar to this metaphysical system in not Near East or any other Mediterranean cultures.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Carla, for your time, for this excellent lecture. And thank you all for joining and listening. And those of you who haven't yet, do join the course. So I'll share the link one more time, perhaps, if I may, to make it easy for you. Just that's the course. We start next week, August 16th. That's a Sunday. We're back to the time that we used to have, which is 12 p.m. Eastern time. Carla is in Florida, so it's different this time. She doesn't have to worry about American time zones. She knows them. I never know what's going on. That's 6 p.m. European time. You might be in Greece, though, at some point. I don't know. So 12 p.m., that's when we start. It's 6 weeks in total, so there's 6 lectures, pre-recorded, and 6 seminars. If you join the seminars, those of you who've been to the seminars, you know what they're like. But this is very much, if you haven't been to any of the seminars, this is what they will be like. So you come in, you've done some of the reading, you've listened to this, you know, you don't have to read all 37 pages of the first handout, but maybe
there is a lot
to
to read if you want to. Yeah, there's. I also put extra hieroglyphs in there sometimes, just for the
just for completion's sake.
Just for fun.
Yeah, but you listen to the lectures about 45 minutes to an hour long each week. You come in and then you ask questions, the usual, you know, thing that we do. Some breakout sessions, discussion. Mike, you know, it's like Seth, you know, it's like Seth has a you know, the perfect name, perhaps, or maybe not. I don't know. You can talk about Egyptian gods. I know nothing about them. So do join. Anything else, Carla, that I forget?
I think what sort of gets lost a little bit is that we also have a great lecture, the fifth one, where we talk about the meaning of life and the purpose of humanity, that I'm really excited about, that has meant a lot to me when the more I studied that culture and their entire outlook on why we're here and what our purpose is. And it's with all the fascination I have for their writing system, for their mortuary beliefs and their cosmology, what we talked about, that part, and to go deeper into their literature that is always forgotten in the modern reception of ancient Egypt. They had a massive and beautiful library of literature that is deeply moving, and we will look at some of their most beautiful poems and There are some of the most beautiful texts also in the cosmology lesson that are deeply moving, because it's just great literature, and people usually don't know that about ancient Egypt, and I wish people knew. So that's something that's very close to my heart, that they have a great body of beautiful literature, but that will all be also part of those little ebooks that I have in those lessons.
They really are ebooks. So so I keep telling her, you know, don't put everything in there. Give them a little bit, but no, she's giving me everything. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Carla. Thank you, everyone else. I hope to see you all in exactly 12 days when we start the course mid-August all the way up to the 20th of September. Thank you again. For me, I say good night. Everyone else have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you for coming.